You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
During the election, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was a little bit perturbed, I think I can say, with the Conservative platform on finances. There was a promise to balance the budget within 10 years, but not really a specific method on how to get there. And now Franco Terrazzano, the federal director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, has a great op-ed in the Financial Post talking about the credibility problem that O'Toole has. Franco Terrazzano joins me now. Franco, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on as always.
Hey, thanks, Andrew, for having me.
So let's start here. Where do you think the credibility problem comes from?
Well, it comes from the fact that O'Toole flip-flopped on some of the biggest issues when it comes to fiscal issues, when it comes to issues for taxpayers. I mean, he flip-flopped on the carbon tax. He flip-flopped on reining in out-of-control government spending. He flip-flopped on repealing the Trudeau government's ineffective and expensive gun ban and buyback. It almost seems like O'Toole was hoping that voters and Canadians wouldn't be paying attention on these issues. But unfortunately for O'Toole, voters aren't stupid. They held him accountable, and now O'Toole has a very, very serious credibility problem.
Yeah, and when you talk about these flip-flops, I'm a firm believer in the importance of a clear and concise and consistent message. And I feel that if you have a clarity in your message and you're consistent in your message, even if not everyone agrees with you, they can at least respect you for knowing where you are. By the end of the campaign, it was unclear where the Conservatives would end up if they were in government on a lot of key issues.
Yeah, it was about as clear as mud, wasn't it? But I mean, these were just complete 180s on some of these. Let's start with the carbon tax. You know, for a while, O'Toole rightly railed against carbon taxes, right? He saw this as an issue that reduces affordability. He even signed the Canadian Taxpayers Federation's pledge when he was running for Conservative Party leader, and the pledge was unequivocal. It said that he would scrap the Trudeau government's carbon tax, and then he would replace it with nothing, so that he would fight carbon taxes. And then just months before the snap election was called, he did a complete 180 and announced that he would be hammering families with a carbon tax of his own. And Andrew, it gets worse because he also said that he would be bringing in what amounts to a second carbon tax through fuel regulations. So when it's all said and done, O'Toole's carbon taxes would have hammered a family for nearly $20 every time they fueled up their minivan.
This was a big one because you're right, and I remember that. I remember with your predecessor, Erin O'Toole signing that no carbon tax pledge, very clear against the carbon tax. And the Conservatives tried to spin their plan as not being a carbon tax because they said that the government wasn't keeping the money. But, I mean, my view on this was that if you're forcing consumers to pay more for something, it's a tax through and through. But, I mean, the worst thing is that it didn't even work. There's a gamble that, okay, if we put this forward, the Conservatives will ingratiate themselves in the hearts and minds of Canadians, and it's not even like they had a win to show for it.
Oh, you're absolutely correct on so many issues there, Andrew. I mean, where do we start? Well, the first part, of course, it's a carbon tax. If the government is going to force consumers to pay more at the pumps, that is a tax. Now, on that issue, I mean, O'Toole was trying to pretend that this wasn't a tax. Well, if you're going to do a 180, if you're going to hammer families with a carbon tax of your own, at least have the spine to admit it rather than play word games and insult Canadians' intelligence. Now, the second issue is that, of course, this was going to raise affordability for Canadians, O'Toole's flip-flop and carbon tax. Now, here's where things really go wrong for O'Toole. One of the key issues that all Canadians coast to coast, no matter what demographic, were concerned about affordability. Well, O'Toole completely lost the leg to stand on affordability, right? Because how can you talk about improving affordability on the one hand, and then on the other hand, hammer families with a carbon tax, which would mean that they would pay nearly $20 extra every time they fill up their minivan? I mean, you can't. And really, that's where O'Toole missed the mark.
Sarah Goodman, who is in the Prime Minister's office, one of the chief climate advisors for Justin Trudeau, said on Twitter after the election results that the re-elected Liberal government is a sign that the government has a mandate to do more on climate and to do it faster. Is there not an argument that by sending Justin Trudeau back to Ottawa, by re-electing a Trudeau government, even in a minority, Canadians are either tacitly or explicitly on board with a carbon tax?
No, I don't think so. I mean, even look at how the Trudeau government brought in its massively increasing carbon tax to $170 per ton in the lead up to the 2019 election. Then Environment Minister for the Trudeau Liberals, Catherine McKenna, she said that the government had no intention to raise the carbon tax beyond $50 per ton. Now, after that Liberal government was elected, they waited until 2 weeks before Christmas of 2020, months before the next election, to announce that they would be raising the carbon tax all the way up to 40 cents per liter of gasoline by 2030. So even the Liberals, of course, have not been telling the truth when it comes to carbon taxes. And I think it's because they know that Canadians really have no appetite to be seeing their cost of living going up. Now, one thing I want to go back on O'Toole's carbon tax, because you kind of brought up a good point, but I didn't follow through on it. And that's this whole idea of the O'Toole savings account. Right? The fact that you're going to pay a higher price at the pump, and then somehow this money is going to be put into a savings account, which you can only be using to buy some green government approved swag. Now, Andrew, you know that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been hammering the Trudeau government's carbon tax. We're going to continue to hammer that carbon tax. It's really just a thinly veiled redistribution scheme. But at least under the Trudeau government's carbon tax, some people will get some of their money back in actual cash. The O'Toole carbon tax was a complete disaster. It was so paternalistic.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole thing. Forget about the lack of, clarity on what you could spend your money on. This idea that, you're going to get this rewards account, this O'Toole Bucks account that then you can use for green purchases. So you can buy a bicycle, maybe, you can buy some energy efficient windows, but having this money sitting in an account that you can't access. I mean, that's been like my Petro Points card, basically, where it's all sitting there and I can't really do anything with it unless I just want to buy gas. That's the one thing that I can do with that, but at least I had a choice in enrolling in that program.
Yeah, O'Toole's carbon tax flip-flop was really a disaster from beginning to end. Really, hey, don't worry, everyone out there in Calgary. Yeah, you're going to be facing higher fuel bills, but hey, you'll be able to cart your groceries home in the middle of January with your new e-scooter. It was just a complete disaster.
I want to turn to the other aspect here, which was the balanced budget thing. Now, I had asked Erin O'Toole about this. I think it was the very first day of the campaign. You say that you're going to balance the budget in 10 years. We've seen the economic situation Canada's in. How are you going to do that? And throughout the campaign, we heard certainly specific promises, but I never saw what are you going to do to, in 10 years, balance the budget. And the caveat here is that because of the spending that we've seen in Canada, not just over the last year and a half, but over the last 6 years of the Liberal government, balancing the budget, tightening the belt is going to be a challenge. But I never really, by the end of the campaign, saw how that was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, this was a tough one, right? This is very tough for Canadian taxpayers. It's really the $1 trillion elephant in the room is the federal government's debt. Now, maybe we give the Conservatives a little bit of credit because they were the only major party that was at least talking about balancing the budget. But make no mistake about it, the O'Toole so-called budget balance plan was not credible. So we remember the data that came out of the parliamentary budget officer, right? That under the current trajectory, we wouldn't see a balanced budget federally until 2070. Well, that was before all of the massive spending promises in this election. Now, somehow O'Toole wanted to spend about $50 billion more than that last Liberal government budget. And he thought that he could balance the budget decades sooner. So he wanted to spend tens of billions of dollars more and thought he could balance the budget decades sooner. Well, Andrew, the math doesn't add up there. And what's so unfortunate about this Conservative Party platform is that for a long time, they've rightly been talking about the dangers of the Trudeau government's runaway spending. We have more than $1 trillion in debt. Even before the pandemic, the Trudeau government brought per person spending to all-time highs. And even under those scenarios, which we are living through, the O'Toole platform still couldn't find any meaningful savings.
Yeah, and the reality is you have to either increase revenue or cut spending. And both of those things are very politically dangerous, some might say, but at the same time, they're also necessary. You don't want to be the one running on cutting the budget. You don't want to be the one running on raising taxes. And that's the thing. So if you're trying to say you're balancing the budget, but you're not articulating which of those two you're going to do, you're missing a key part of the arithmetic here.
Yeah, there's a few things there, and Andrew, I'm just going to push back slightly on
please.
what's politically popular. Well, I think it actually is politically popular for some governments to actually find some savings and to actually stop with this crazy spending. For example, I think it would be very politically popular if one of these parties, O'Toole, for example, were to have come out and said, hey, we are going to reverse the 2 pandemic pay raises that all members of parliament received. I think that would have been very popular. I think it would have shown Canadians that, you know what, maybe these politicians do kind of get what we're going through. And there's other areas of the budget they could have cut. I think it would have been popular for these politicians to say, we are going to put an end to corporate welfare. We don't need to be giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the Ford Motor Company, for example. I think it would also have been very popular to say, hey, we are going to force all political parties to pay back the wage subsidy that was never meant for them. So Andrew, you know, I agree with you to an extent, but I think it would have been very popular for parties to actually come out and be like, look, guys, there is definitely some fat up here in Ottawa, and we're going to do our best to trim that fat.
No, and I very much agree with that. And I should qualify by saying the landmines that are being set by opposition whenever you talk about cuts makes it politically risky. But you're right. If you were very clear about what it is you want to do, I don't think most Canadians would say, yeah, I think they'd all agree with it. Just very briefly here, Franco, let's talk about affordability. You mentioned it before in the context of the carbon tax. We've seen skyrocketing inflation. I didn't see a lot of discussion in general about this, about how to rein in inflation from any of the parties.
Yeah, it's really quite unfortunate. And I think the reason is because a politician cannot credibly talk about improving affordability without taking a very hard look in the mirror and looking at what the federal government is doing to reduce affordability. Now, we've already talked about taxes. Of course, we've talked about the carbon tax. That is an obvious way that the federal government drives up the cost of living. But of course, there's a myriad of other different types of taxes. Even during the pandemic, the average Canadian family paid about 36% of its budget to taxes, which is more than what that average Canadian family paid for things like housing, food and clothing combined. So certainly tax relief, which we didn't see any broad-based tax relief, would improve affordability. But Andrew, the second thing, which some members of parliament are talking about, is the inflation tax, right? When the government prints more dollars, your dollars buy less. Now, some members of parliament are talking about it, but if we really want to have a legitimate conversation about how to improve affordability on Canada, we have to talk about the government's printing press.
Yeah, no, very much agree with that. And this is, again, something that if we are talking about, to go back to the Conservative leadership, what the party does moving forward, or any party, I'd like to see them take these things seriously. I mean, if you're going to say that the Conservative Party is going to have this one-track focus on the economy, on taxes, on affordability, great, do it, and do it well. Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always a pleasure, good sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.